The vote was already over when I walked into the chamber. I knew it before the doors sealed behind me. I could feel it in the way the Cathani delegates refused to look at the human table. I could feel it in the silence that had settled over 4,000 species packed into the Grand Accord Hall of Vorith Station. A silence so complete that the recycled air itself seemed to be holding its breath. My name is Kale, and I am a Sinari diplomatic observer. I have attended 43 sessions of the Galactic Accord in my lifetime. I have watched species beg, argue, weep, and threaten one another across that great circular floor. I have seen the outcomes of votes that reshuffled the borders of entire star systems. But I have never, in all my years, felt a silence like the one that greeted the human delegation when they entered. Ambassador Yara Ose walked at the front of the group. She was a small woman by human standards, with dark brown skin and close-cut hair that had gone gray at the temples. She wore a plain dark suit with no insignia except the small blue pin that marked her as Earth's senior representative to the Accord. She did not hurry. She did not slow down. She walked at exactly the pace of someone who had somewhere to be and enough time to get there. And she took her seat at the circular table as though she were sitting down for a morning meal. The rest of her delegation followed, 6 humans in total, 3 men and 3 women, none of them wearing expressions I could easily read. One of the men, a tall fellow named Colin Reeve, who served as Earth's legal attaché, actually pulled out a small notepad and a pen as he sat down. A real pen, ink and paper. I had learned enough about humans by then to understand that this was significant in some way I could not fully explain. The way that a bird spreading its wings is significant even before it decides whether to fly. Chair being Vreth Sul called the session to order from the elevated central platform. Vreth Sul was a Cathani, which meant 7 limbs, 3 optical clusters, and a voice that resonated at frequencies most species found uncomfortable. The Cathani had chaired the Accord for 6 generations, long enough that many smaller species simply assumed the position belonged to them by some natural law. Vreth Sul unrolled the formal proclamation with 2 of his limbs and cleared his speaking organ with a sound like gravel sliding down a metal ramp. The Galactic Accord has completed its deliberative process, he said, regarding Resolution 7741, which is formally titled the Terran Exclusion and Containment Measure. The tally has been recorded, verified, and certified by the Council of Observers. I will now read the result. Nobody moved. I do not mean that the hall became still. I mean that every creature in it, 4,000 delegates, 200 observers, 30 journalists from across the Sinari press pool, not a single one of them shifted in their seat, or adjusted their breathing, or turned their head. The moment was that large. Total voting members present, 4,719. Votes in favor of the resolution, 4,718. Votes against the resolution, 1. He did not say which single member had voted against. He did not need to. I watched Yara Ose's face. Nothing changed in it. Not a tightening of the jaw, not a flicker behind the eyes, not the slight drawing in of breath that I had learned to recognize in humans when they received bad news. She sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her and looked at Vreth Sul with the expression of someone listening to information they already knew, processed, and filed away long before it was officially delivered. Colin Reeve wrote something in his notepad. Vreth Sul continued reading. The resolution, in its full form, ran to 14 pages in the common trade language, and he read every word of it aloud, as was required by Accord procedure. The terms were comprehensive and thorough, in a way that spoke of months of preparation. Earth was to be immediately barred from the Galactic Hyperspace Relay Network, which meant that all human vessels would be limited to their own slower drive systems for interstellar travel, adding years to journeys that currently took weeks. Earth's membership in the Joint Defense Compact was suspended, which meant no allied protection in the event of an external threat. All bilateral trade agreements between Earth and Accord member states were to be frozen, pending a review process that, according to the resolution's own language, would not begin for a minimum of 3 standard years. Earth's diplomatic missions across the 42 star systems where humanity maintained embassies were to be downgraded from full embassy status to observer posts, which stripped them of legal protections, formal communication rights, and the ability to negotiate on Earth's behalf in local disputes. Every human ship entering Accord space would require an escort of 3 allied vessels. Every cargo load would be subject to inspection. Every human citizen traveling within Accord-controlled systems would be required to carry documentation that no other species was asked to carry, and to register their movements with local Accord authorities within 6 hours of arrival in any port. It went on. I stopped counting the specific provisions somewhere around page 9. The hall remained utterly silent throughout, which told me something important. None of this was a surprise to anyone else present. This had been agreed upon beforehand. The session was not deliberation. It was announcement. When Vreth Sul finished, he set the document down and looked at the human table. "Ambassador Osei," he said, with the particular inflection the Cathani used when they wanted to convey that a formality was being observed, rather than a genuine question asked. "Does the Terran delegation wish to respond?" Yara Osei unfolded her hands. She pressed one finger to the small communication pad on the table in front of her, the device that would carry her voice across the entire hall. She looked at Vreth Sul directly. "Thank you for the formal notice," she said. "We will be in touch." Then she stood up. All 6 humans stood up simultaneously, as though a single signal had passed between them that I had not detected. Colin Reeve capped his pen. He tucked the notepad under his arm. He pushed his chair back from the table with a small, precise movement. Not hurried, not dramatic, just the ordinary motion of a person who has concluded their business somewhere and is ready to go. They walked out. No raised voices, no parting declarations, no sweeping final statement that history would record. They simply left, at the same pace at which they had entered, and the doors sealed behind them, and the Grand Accord Hall of Voreth Station was left with 4,718 species and an empty table where Earth had been sitting. The silence lasted for several seconds after they were gone. Then Vreth Sul said, "The session is adjourned," and the noise began, and I sat in my observer's seat and stared at that empty table and tried to understand what I had just witnessed. I had seen defeats before. I had seen species lose votes that cost them trade routes, territory, political standing. I had seen the ambassadors of broken nations accept the rulings of the Accord with dignity and pain in equal measure. I knew what it looked like when a people lost something important and chose to bear it with grace. This had not looked like that. This had looked like something else, something I did not have a precise word for in my own language. The closest I could come was a Sonari concept that translated roughly as the patience of something that has already decided. I went back to my quarters on Voreth Station that evening and wrote my first observer report. It was brief. I said that the resolution had passed as expected, that the human delegation had received the verdict without visible distress, and that I recommended continued monitoring of Earth's response over the following 30 to 90 rotations. I sent the report, and I sat by the small window that looked out over the docking ring, and I watched a human cargo ship unhook from its berth and begin the slow process of pulling away from the station. It was a mid-sized freighter, nothing remarkable. The letters on its hull were in the human script. The running lights blinked in the standard pattern. It moved the way all cargo ships move when they are leaving port, carefully, patiently, watching for other traffic, giving way where necessary, taking the long, slow arc around the station's navigational boundary before orienting itself toward whatever destination had been entered into its navigation system. I watched it until it was too small to see. Then I went to bed. I did not sleep well. The next morning, I attended the post-resolution briefing that the Accord Secretariat held for all senior observers. There were about 40 of us in the room, diplomatic professionals from a dozen different species, and the mood was one of settled satisfaction. The legal advisor for the Cathani delegation, a sharp-minded bureaucrat named Sir Rel, stood at the front of the room with a large display behind him showing the projected effects of the embargo. Trade disruption to Earth, severe. Estimated impact on human interstellar commerce, 60 to 70% reduction within the first year. Quantum fuel access, cut off. The fuel that human ships used for their faster drive systems came from processing facilities in the Vela cluster, and every single one of those facilities was operated by Accord member states. Without that fuel, human ships would be running on their backup drive technology, which was older and slower and expensive in ways that would compound rapidly across a civilization that had built its expansion on fast, cheap interstellar travel. Rare element imports to Earth's orbital foundries, frozen. Humanity had large, sophisticated manufacturing operations in orbit around their planet, and scattered across their home system. But those operations depended on materials that did not exist in useful quantities in the Sol system. Stopping the supply would not immediately shut down the foundries, because there would be stockpiles, but it would begin a slow degradation that the Accord's economists projected would become critical within 18 months. Sirrell walked through each category with the careful thoroughness of someone who had spent a great deal of time on this analysis, and was proud of the work. He showed charts. He showed projections. He showed comparison points with other species that had been sanctioned by the Accord in the past, and how long those sanctions had taken to produce the desired change in behavior. The historical average for compliance, he said, under a sanction regime of this comprehensiveness, is between 14 and 22 months. We expect Earth to request formal negotiations within that window. Someone near the back of the room, a Dreth observer named Velarun, who I had spoken with several times, and who had a gift for the kind of question that sounds simple but is not, raised his hand. What is Earth being asked to comply with, specifically? He said. What is the behavior that the Accord wants changed? Sirrell looked at him with the patient expression of someone answering a question they consider too basic for the setting. The resolution identifies several areas of concern, he said. Human expansion into contested border territories. Human vessels operating in deep space zones without adequate notification to local traffic authorities. The Terran government's repeated refusal to submit its military vessel specifications to the Accord's Joint Defense Registry, and the broader pattern of what the resolution describes as unilateral action in sectors where Accord consensus is required. Velarun nodded slowly. So the Accord's position is that Earth has been behaving in ways that are not sufficiently cooperative with the larger galactic community, and the solution is to remove Earth from the larger galactic community. Sirrell opened his mouth, closed it. The solution is to apply sufficient pressure to encourage Earth to participate in the community, on terms that the community has established. By excluding them. By demonstrating that exclusion is the cost of non-compliance. Velarun nodded again and said nothing more, but the look on his face was one I recognized. It was the look of someone who has noticed a flaw in the reasoning but has decided that pointing it out in this particular room, to these particular people, would be a waste of energy. I filed that away. I filed everything away in those early days, because I had not yet developed the vocabulary for what I was watching, and so I collected details the way you collect pieces of something you have found on the ground, without yet knowing what it will turn out to be when you put it together. After the briefing, I walked through the commercial district of Voreth Station. It was a large, busy space, the kind of place where a dozen species conducted ordinary trade at any hour of the cycle. I was looking for the human merchants I knew operated several stalls near the central exchange. They were still there, all of them. A man named Gary Holt, who sold technical components, was in the middle of a transaction with a Sonari engineer. He was explaining something about tolerances, while the engineer held up a small device and turned it over in her hands. Gary was using hand gestures to supplement the translation device on the counter between them, the universal improvisation of commerce, conducted across a language gap. A woman named Dee Cartwright, who ran a small food import operation, was restocking her display with packages that smelled extraordinary, in the particular way that human food so often did, complex and layered in a manner that other species' cuisine rarely managed. She caught me looking and gave me a brief nod of recognition. I had bought something from her once. It had been very good. Neither of them seemed diminished by what had happened the previous day. Neither of them seemed to be behaving like people whose civilization had just been formally excluded from the galactic community. They were doing what they had been doing the day before. Trading, explaining, restocking, nodding, working. I stopped at Gary's stall after his customer left and asked him, as diplomatically as I could, whether he was aware of what had happened in the Accord session. Sure, he said, and began sorting components into a small tray. And? I said. He looked up at me with the particular human expression that I had learned to associate with the careful selection of honest words. And what? How do you feel about it? He considered this for a moment. I feel like I've got 12 orders to fill before end of cycle, and the Accord's resolution doesn't change that. I stood there for a moment, trying to find the right follow-up question. Does it worry you? I finally asked. Gary Holt set down the component he was holding and looked at me directly. He was maybe 40 years old, with the kind of face that had spent time outdoors in conditions that weather it, and his expression when he looked at me was not dismissive. It was something more like the expression of a person who has thought about something longer and in more depth than you might expect, and has arrived at a position of clarity about it. "I worried plenty when I was young," he said, "about things that were real threats and things that turned out not to be. You get a feel for the difference after a while." "And this?" I said. He picked up his component again. "This doesn't feel like a real threat." I walked back to my quarters and sat for a long time with that sentence. Around me, Vorith Station continued its ordinary life. Ships docked and departed. Cargo moved through corridors. Languages I could partially understand, and ones I could not at all, washed over each other in the public spaces. Somewhere in the docking ring, that mid-sized human freighter I had watched leave the previous evening had been replaced by another one. Same hull configuration, different name, same steady blinking lights. It was carrying something in its hold that I could not identify from the manifest summary I had access to as an observer. I noted it. I noted everything, because Gary Holt had told me this did not feel like a real threat, and I had learned enough about humans by then to understand that their instincts in that direction were worth taking seriously. What I had not yet learned, what would take me the better part of the next year to fully understand, was that the thing Gary was not worried about, and the thing Cyrell was so confident about, were not actually the same thing. The Accord thought they were threatening Earth's survival. Earth was not worried about its survival. Earth was thinking about something else entirely. I just did not know what yet. 3 days after the vote, I received a message from my supervisor at the Sinari Diplomatic Service. It was a standard check-in, asking for my preliminary assessment and whether I expected the situation to develop in any unusual direction. I wrote back that the situation appeared to be proceeding normally. I sent the message. Then I sat down at my small desk and looked at the wall for a while. Normally was not the word I actually believed, but I did not yet have the right word to replace it with, and in my experience, the danger in diplomatic work is not the things you report incorrectly. It is the things you hesitate to report because they make you sound like you have lost your professional distance. What I wanted to write was this: I watched 4,718 species vote to strand a civilization, and the representatives of that civilization walked out of the room looking like they were mildly inconvenienced and already bored. And I went to the commercial district and spoke to a human merchant who told me, very calmly, that this does not feel like a real threat, and I do not know whether he is wrong, or whether we are. I did not write that. I wrote that the situation appeared to be proceeding normally. But I added one more line at the end, the kind of professional hedge that is technically meaningless, and practically a way of making a note to yourself. I wrote, "Recommend continued observation. Situation may develop in unexpected directions." 48 hours later, the first invoice arrived, and I understood that I had been right to hedge. The cosmos voted to ban Earth. Humanity smirked and simply kept going. The invoice was addressed to the Accord Secretariat's Logistics Division. It came from a company called Orbital Standard Solutions, registered in the Dreth Confederation, with offices listed on 3 different space stations. The letterhead was plain. The language was professional. The content was a quarterly billing statement for ongoing supply of quantum coherent stabilizers to 17 Accord member fleets, including the Cathani Home Defense Armada. The company had been supplying these components for 11 years. Nobody at the Accord had made the connection. The connection was this: Orbital Standard Solutions was a subsidiary of a company registered in New Auckland, Earth. The stabilizers that kept hyperdrives from tearing themselves apart across 17 of the Accord's most powerful military fleets had been made by humans, shipped by humans, and maintained under service contracts held by humans for over a decade, under different names, through different corporate structures, quietly, steadily, unremarkably. The invoice was not a threat. It was, technically, just a bill. But it came with a note at the bottom, in the polite, formal language of commercial correspondence, that said the company was reviewing its service arrangements in light of recent changes to the operating environment, and that clients with questions about continuity of supply were welcome to contact the account management team. The account management team, I later learned, was a single human woman named Frances Cole, working out of an office on Corel Station, who had a very pleasant voice and a gift for saying nothing useful in the most reassuring possible way. I read the invoice 3 times. Then I went back to my window and watched the docking ring. There were 6 human ships in port. There had been 4 the day before. None of them were doing anything remarkable. They were just there, going about their business, in the way that water goes about the business of finding the lowest point in a room, patiently, inevitably, without any particular announcement. I thought about writing a new report. I thought about what to say in it. I opened my message interface and stared at the blank page for a long time. Outside, the docking ring hummed and blinked and turned, and the human ships sat in their berths, and somewhere on one of those ships, someone was probably making a list of things that needed to be done, and working through it, one item at a time, with the particular focused calm of a species that had somewhere to be and enough time to get there. I closed the message interface without writing anything. I needed to think for a while longer before I had the right words, because what I was beginning to understand, slowly and with the particular discomfort of someone watching a very large thing happen in very small pieces, was that the Accord had made an assumption that was so obvious to them that they had never bothered to question it. They had assumed that when you remove a species from the galactic community, the species becomes less. They had not considered the possibility that the species had already built a different kind of community, quietly, over many years, in the spaces between what was visible and what was reported, and that removing them from the official structure would not remove them from that other, older, quieter one. They had not considered Gary Holt, sorting components into a tray with steady hands. They had not considered Frances Cole, with her pleasant voice and her useful gift for saying nothing. They had not considered the 6 ships in the docking ring, sitting still and doing nothing remarkable. They had not considered what it means to vote against a species that has been surviving difficult things for 400,000 years, and has never, not once, in all of recorded history, looked at a hard situation and concluded that giving up was the rational response. I thought about Yara Ose walking out of that hall, not hurrying, not slowing down, just walking, at exactly the pace of someone who had somewhere to be and enough time to get there. I opened my message interface again. This time, I wrote something different. I wrote, reassessing preliminary analysis. Situation more complex than initially reported. Stand by for updated assessment. I sent it. Then I put on my coat and went back out to the commercial district, because I wanted to talk to Gary Holt again. He was not at his stall, but Dee Cartwright was, and she was talking to someone I had not seen before. A young human man, maybe 25 years old, with a tablet in one hand and a very focused expression, making notes about something she was showing him in her inventory system. I did not interrupt them. I watched for a moment, and then I walked on, and I thought about invoices, and subsidiaries, and quiet service contracts, and ships that sit in docking rings doing nothing remarkable, and a woman named Frances Cole with a pleasant voice, and 400,000 years of a species that has never once concluded that giving up was the rational response. And I began to understand what the word smirk actually means. It does not mean amusement. It means you already know how this ends. That evening, the Accord's Logistics Division sent an urgent internal memo to all senior administrators. I was not supposed to have access to it. I had access to it. It said that 17 member fleets had received unusual billing notifications from a supplier, and that legal was reviewing the corporate chain of the company in question. It said that preliminary review suggested potential Terran ownership structures, but that this was unconfirmed. It said that any administrators with questions about supply chain continuity should escalate through official channels and not contact the supplier directly until the review was complete. The memo ended with a line that I read 4 times. It said, "Do not respond to any communications from the account management team until further notice." Frances Cole was going to have a very quiet few days. But she was not, I suspected, worried about it. I went to sleep that night with the image of Yara Ose's face behind my eyes. That expression, that folded hands patience, that complete, total absence of the thing I had expected to see. I had called it a lack of distress. I was starting to understand that it was something more specific than that. It was the expression of someone who had already played out every possible version of this conversation in their mind, followed every branch of the decision tree, accounted for every move the other side was likely to make, and arrived, with perfect confidence, at the knowledge of how it was going to end. Not arrogance, not dismissal. just the calm of someone doing a calculation they have already completed. I lay in the dark and thought about Frances Cole and her account management team. I thought about what it means when the most powerful alliance in the known galaxy moves to exclude a species, and the species responds by sending an invoice. I thought about Gary Holt and his components, and his 12 orders, and his settled opinion that this did not feel like a real threat. The ceiling of my small observer's quarter was very plain. There was nothing to look at. I looked at it anyway. Outside, somewhere in the docking ring, a human ship was probably preparing to depart, running its checks, loading its cargo, setting its course, going about its business, at exactly the pace of something that has somewhere to be and enough time to get there. I closed my eyes. I did not sleep well, but for the first time, I thought I was beginning to understand why. The Accord had voted. The embargo was in place. The terms had been read aloud in a hall full of 4,718 species, and the human delegation had listened, and stood up, and left. And somewhere in the quiet machinery of interstellar commerce, in subsidiary companies and service contracts and account management teams and cargo manifests, that nobody at the Accord had thought to look at closely enough, something was already in motion. Not a response, not a plan, not a carefully designed reaction to the vote. Something that had already been in motion for a long time. Long before the vote was called. Long before anyone thought to call it. Long before, perhaps, anyone at the Accord had fully understood what they were dealing with. I wrote one more line in my personal journal that night. Not in any report, not for any official record, just for myself. I wrote, "I think we may have made a mistake." Then I closed the journal. And outside, the ships blinked and turned, and moved through the dark, and the galaxy went on around them, and nobody at the Accord was looking closely enough at the ones that were human. Not yet. But they would be. Very, very soon. The next morning, 3 more invoices arrived. Different companies, different star systems, different products. All of them, when you followed the corporate chain far enough, ended in the same place. New Auckland, Earth. The Accord's legal division opened 17 separate review files before noon. Frances Cole, I later heard, had made a pot of tea and was working through her correspondence at her usual pace. Her voice, when she finally did take calls, remained very pleasant. It always did. That was what made it so unsettling. Not the invoices, not the corporate structures, not the supply chain dependency that the Accord was only now beginning to map with growing alarm. It was the tone. The same tone as Yara Ose walking out of the hall. The same tone as Gary Holt sorting his components. The same tone as Dee Cartwright training her new assistant, showing him inventory systems with the focused patience of someone building something meant to last. The tone of a species that had somewhere to be and enough time to get there. The tone of something that was not worried, because it already knew how this ended. I sat at my desk and read the 3 new invoices and thought about all the ones we had not found yet. And I began, for the first time, to feel something that I suspected was the opening edge of a very large and very uncomfortable realization. The Accord had voted to ban Earth. Humanity had received the news, thanked the chair being for the formal notice, capped their pens, pushed back their chairs, and walked out the door. And now, the morning after, the galaxy was waking up to discover that it had not banned Earth at all. It had simply announced to Earth that the pretense was over. And Earth had responded by sending the bill. The bill for everything, quietly, steadily, unremarkably, over many years, they had already built. I looked at my report interface. I thought about what to write. I thought for a long time. And then I wrote, very carefully, the most important sentence I had ever put in an official diplomatic document. I wrote, "The preliminary assessment was incorrect. Recommend immediate escalation to senior counsel. The situation is not developing as projected." I sent it. Then I stood up and put on my coat and went to find Gary Holt, because I had more questions. And for the first time in my career, I was not entirely sure I was going to like the answers. The second invoice from Frances Cole's department arrived at the Accord's Trade Administration office at the same hour I was walking through the commercial district looking for Gary Holt's stall. It was not, in any technical sense, any different from a routine billing statement. The figures were accurate. The service descriptions were clear. The payment terms were standard. There was nothing in the document that a trade administrator, reading it carefully, could object to on procedural grounds. What made the administrator who received it go immediately to her supervisor was not the content, it was the timing. The Terran exclusion resolution had passed 31 hours earlier, and here, 31 hours later, was a billing statement from a company that had, in the previous decade, quietly become one of the 17 most important suppliers to the Accord's combined logistics network. The administrator's supervisor read the invoice. Then she read it again. Then she pulled up the corporate registry and started following the chain of ownership, which was long and carefully structured and passed through 3 different regulatory jurisdictions before arriving at its origin point. She was still reading when I found Gary Holt at a different location than his usual stall. He had moved to a larger space, 2 sections down from where he normally operated, and he was in the middle of setting up what appeared to be a significantly expanded display of components. I stopped and watched him for a moment. He was working with a younger human, a woman named Nell Bright who I had seen around the station before, and they were arranging things with the concentrated efficiency of people who had done this kind of work many times and knew exactly how to do it well. "You moved," I said. Gary looked up. "Got more space. Been needing more space for a while. This seemed like a good time to make the change." "A good time," I said. "Sure," he said. "Things are going to be busy for a while. Figured I should be set up properly." I looked at the expanded display. The range of components was significantly broader than what he had been carrying before. Some of them I recognized as items that had previously come to the station through Accord-affiliated supply chains. "Where are these from?" I asked. He told me. The origin points were scattered, some from human manufacturing operations I was familiar with, others from smaller independent producers in parts of the galaxy that the Accord's logistics networks did not heavily cover. "How long have you been building relationships with those suppliers?" I asked. He tilted his head slightly, not evasively, just the way a person tilts their head when they are calculating back through time. 10 years, maybe. Some of them longer. "Before the resolution," I said. "Long before," he said. He picked up a component from a box and set it on the display with careful precision. "You plan for things, don't you? You don't wait until you need something to figure out where you are going to get it." Nell Bright said something under her breath that I did not quite catch, and Gary made a sound that was the human equivalent of restrained laughter. "She says that's the most generous description of the situation she has heard all week," he told me. I thought about that for a moment. "What would be a less generous description?" I asked. Gary looked at me, and this time the expression was something I had not seen from him before. It was not unkind, but it was the expression of a person deciding how much of a true thing to say to someone who may not be ready for all of it. "The less generous description," he said, "is that we have been watching the direction of the wind for a while, and we made our arrangements accordingly." Nell Bright set down a box and went to get another one from the storage area behind the stall. I stayed and watched Gary arrange his components. I thought about the wind. I thought about Francis Cole's invoice. I thought about the administrator following the corporate chain through 3 regulatory jurisdictions. I thought about Yara Osei and her capped pen and her folded hands. I thought about what it means when a species watches the direction of the wind. I thought about how long you have to watch it before you know, with certainty, which way it is going to blow. And I thought about how much you can build in that time, quietly, steadily, without any particular announcement, if you are a species that has been doing exactly that for 400,000 years. I said goodbye to Gary and walked back toward my quarters. On the way, I passed a communication terminal and checked the Accord internal news feed, which I had access to through my observer credentials. The top item was a notice from the Accord's legal administration. It said that a review of supply chain dependencies was being initiated and that all member states were asked to submit relevant procurement information within the next 10 rotations. The second item was a brief note from the Accord's Trade Monitoring Division. It said that an unusual pattern of commercial activity had been detected in several sectors and was being investigated. The third item was a short message from Chair Being Vreth Sewell's office. It said that the Chair Being wished to remind all member states that the Terran exclusion resolution was in full force and that any questions about implementation should be directed to the Secretariat. None of the 3 items used the word invoice. None of them used the word Francis. None of them used the word concern, although I suspected that concern was the thing they most accurately described. I went back to my quarters and sat down at my desk. I opened a new message and addressed it to my supervisor. I typed, "Updated assessment follows. The situation is developing in a direction that was not anticipated in the original resolution's impact analysis. Human commercial infrastructure in this region is significantly deeper than the pre-resolution surveys suggested. Recommend immediate and comprehensive review of all supply contracts held by Accord member states before any enforcement action is escalated." I paused. Then I added one more line. "I believe the human delegation knew the full scope of this infrastructure when they attended the session yesterday. I believe Ambassador Osei's response to the resolution was based on that knowledge. I believe the note in her delegation's data communication to the Secretariat, which read, 'We will be in touch,' was not a diplomatic formality." I sent the message. Then I sat for a long time looking at the wall. Somewhere on Vorith Station, in an office I had never visited, a woman named Frances Cole was probably finishing her tea and picking up her next communication. Somewhere in the Accord's legal division, an administrator was still following a corporate chain through 3 regulatory jurisdictions and had not yet arrived at the end of it. Somewhere in the docking ring, a human ship was loading cargo. Outside my window, the station turned slowly in the dark, and I thought about all the things that had been quietly, steadily, unremarkably built over 10 years and longer in the spaces between what was reported and what was real. I thought about the direction of the wind. I thought about the expression on Yara Osei's face, and I understood, finally, with the particular cold clarity of a realization that arrives too late to change anything, what the word smirk actually means. It means you knew this was coming, and you got ready. Long, long before anyone else thought to. The first fleet response came 12 days after the vote, and I watched it from the observation deck of Vorith Station, with a feeling I could not name in either my own language or the trade tongue. 17 Accord warships arrived at the outer boundary of the Sol system in a formation that their commanders had clearly designed to communicate something. They arranged themselves in a wide arc, engines hot, weapons systems powered to a state that every long-range sensor on every monitoring station in the region would read as active. It was a display, not yet an action, but a display with the language of action built into it, the way a raised hand is not a strike but carries the shape of one. I was not supposed to have access to the tactical feeds from those ships. I had access to them. The fleet commander was a Cathani admiral named Genyura, one of the most decorated military figures in the Accord's recent history. He had fought in the Dreth border disputes. He had commanded the relief operation during the Pale Plague blockade. He was, by every professional measure that the galaxy used to assess such things, someone who understood how force is applied, and what it accomplishes, and when it stops accomplishing it. He positioned his fleet at the outer boundary. He sent the standard Accord notification to Earth's traffic monitoring network, a formal declaration of intent to enforce Resolution 7741, with a demand that all human vessels within and departing the Sol system register their movements with his command and comply with the escort requirements laid out in the resolution's terms. Then he waited. For 6 hours, nothing happened. I watched the tactical feeds. His fleet held position. The Sol system's traffic moved in its ordinary patterns, the slow, steady procession of ships going about their business around a yellow star, cargo runs and transit vessels and the occasional military ship moving through its patrol route. None of them stopped. None of them altered course. None of them sent the registration notifications that Genyura had demanded. After 6 hours, he sent a second notification. This one had more formal language in it and referenced specific provisions of the resolution. It ended with a statement that non-compliance would be met with appropriate enforcement measures. The Sol system sent back a single automated message. It came from Earth's Traffic Authority, the civilian body that managed navigational coordination in the system. It said, in the polite and precise language of bureaucratic correspondence, that the Traffic Authority had received the Accord Fleet's communication, that all requests from non-terrestrial authorities regarding Sol system traffic management should be directed to the Terran Diplomatic Service, and that the Traffic Authority wished the Accord Fleet a safe and uneventful patrol. That was all. Genyura, from what I understand of his biography, was not a man who lost his composure easily. He had been in more tense situations than most people alive. But I have been told, by a source I will not identify, that when he received that automated message from the Terran Traffic Authority, he read it 3 times in complete silence, and then he said to his tactical officer, very quietly, "Run the numbers again. Full sweep. I want to know what is actually in this system." His tactical officer ran the numbers. She came back with an answer that took her 17 minutes to compile, because what she found required her to verify it twice before she was willing to put her name on it. I saw the summary of what she found. Not immediately. A few days later, through channels. But I saw it. The number of functional human vessels in the Sol system was larger than the Accord's intelligence files had indicated. Not slightly larger, significantly larger. The discrepancy was in the range of several hundred ships, distributed across the asteroid belt, in high orbit around several of the system's larger planets, and in positional clusters that corresponded, when you looked at them on a tactical map, to something that was not quite a defensive grid, and not quite random distribution, but occupied the space between those two descriptions in a way that was clearly intentional. None of these ships were broadcasting anything threatening. None of them had moved. None of them had altered their operational status in any visible way. They were just there, in a system that the Accord had expected to find partially depleted of military capacity, which was one of the assumptions underlying the Resolution's enforcement strategy. The number of ships that could respond to a situation was not what anyone had planned around. Gen Yura sent his 3rd notification. This one did not have the language of enforcement in it. It had the language of dialogue. It requested a communication channel with the Terran Diplomatic Service at their earliest convenience. The response came from a man named Alan Marsh, a deputy attaché in the diplomatic service, who had a voice so calm and unhurried that I later learned several Accord officials had initially assumed he was an automated system. He thanked the Admiral for his message. He said that Ambassador Osei would be available for a communication at a time of mutual convenience. He said that the Terran Diplomatic Service wished to note, for the record, that the ships currently present in the Sol system were conducting their ordinary operations and posed no threat to anyone. He said this the way you say a thing that is true, and that you know the other party knows is true, and that you are stating primarily, so that the record reflects you said it. Then he said, in the same unhurried voice, that the Terran government had a technical question about the Resolution's enforcement provisions, and wondered if the Admiral would be the appropriate person to address it, or whether it should go through the Secretariat. The Admiral said he could address technical questions. Alan Marsh said that Resolution 7741 required human vessels to accept a 3-ship escort when entering Accord space, and that the Terran government understood and would observe that requirement, but that the resolution did not appear to contain any provisions that extended Accord jurisdiction to the Sol system itself, which was Terran sovereign space, and that therefore the fleet currently present at the Sol system boundary was positioned in a manner that the Terran government would need to characterize as an incursion rather than an enforcement action, and that the Terran government wished to give the Admiral the opportunity to clarify his fleet's status before any formal objection was filed with the Accord Secretariat. There was a pause in the communication. A long one. Alan Marsh waited through it with the patience of someone who has nowhere else to be. The Admiral said he would need to review the precise language of the resolution and consult with legal counsel before responding to that characterization. Alan Marsh said that was entirely understandable and that he would await the Admiral's response, and wished him a good cycle. The communication ended. I learned later that Gen Yura spent 4 hours with his legal staff going through Resolution 7741. They found that Alan Marsh was technically correct. The resolution's enforcement provisions applied to human vessels in Accord space. They did not grant the Accord fleet any authority to position itself at the boundary of sovereign Terran territory and demand compliance with navigational registration requirements inside that territory. It was not a loophole. It was a fundamental structural gap in the resolution's drafting, the kind of gap that appears when the people writing a document are so certain of its outcome that they do not check it carefully. Gen Yura had 2 options. He could file a counter-interpretation with the Accord Secretariat, which would take months to resolve through proper channels, and during which time he would be sitting at the boundary of the Sol system looking very large and accomplishing very little. Or he could reposition his fleet to a less contested location and wait for the Secretariat to sort out the jurisdictional question. He chose the second option. His fleet moved to the Helios relay point, which was Accord space, about 2 standard days' travel from the sole boundary. Technically an enforcement position. Practically very far from anything he was supposed to be enforcing. I read the communication log summary and thought about Alan Marsh's unhurried voice. I thought about the particular patience required to sit across from a fleet of 17 warships and raise a jurisdictional question in the tone of someone asking about a minor administrative confusion. I thought about the fact that Alan Marsh, deputy attaché, had probably known about that structural gap in the resolution before the vote was ever called. I thought about what it means when you know something like that and you say nothing. You wait. You let the other side make their move. You let them commit to a position. And then you raise the question. Quietly. In the voice of someone who is simply trying to get the administrative details sorted out correctly. That is not weakness. That is the opposite of weakness. That is what patience looks like when it has been sharpened over a very long time into something precise. I filed an updated report. I said that the enforcement operation had encountered jurisdictional complications and had repositioned. I said that the situation continued to develop in ways that differed from projected outcomes. I said that I was revising my assessment upward in terms of complexity. I did not say what I was actually thinking. What I was actually thinking was this. Every single move that the Accord had made since the vote had been anticipated. I did not have proof of this. I had an accumulating weight of evidence that pointed in that direction more clearly with each passing day. The invoices, the corporate structures, the ships in the Sol system, the gap in the resolution's drafting. Each of these was individually explicable as coincidence or oversight or the ordinary complexity of large-scale governance. Together, they did not feel like coincidence. Together, they felt like a long game. A very long game, played quietly, across many years, by a species that had learned to think in timescales that made most other civilizations uncomfortable. On the 15th day after the vote, I did something that I had been considering for several days and had kept talking myself out of. I requested a meeting with Ambassador Yara Osei. She agreed immediately, which surprised me. I had expected to be routed through several layers of diplomatic protocol and told that the ambassador was unavailable. Instead, her office replied within 2 hours, with a time and a location. The location was a small cafe on Vorith Station, a human-operated place near the commercial district that I had walked past many times but never entered. It served food and drinks from several different species traditions, and when I arrived, Osei was already seated at a corner table, with a cup of something warm in front of her and a small tablet that she set aside when I came in. She was, up close, and without the formal context of the Accord chamber, both smaller and more present than I had expected. She had the particular quality that some humans develop over long careers in high-pressure environments, a kind of concentrated stillness, as though the energy that other people spend on fidgeting and uncertainty has been redirected entirely into attention. She offered me a chair. I sat. "You have questions," she said. It was not quite a question itself. "Many," I told her. "Ask one," she said. "We can decide where to go from there." I thought about the questions I had prepared. I had organized them into categories: strategic, tactical, historical, the shape of what humanity had built and how long it had taken, the gap in the resolution, Francis Cole, the ships in the Sol system, the corporate chains. I set all of that aside and asked the question that had been underneath all the others since the day I walked into the chamber and felt the silence. "Did you know?" I said. She looked at me without expression. "Know what specifically?" "All of it," I said. "Before the vote, did you know what was going to happen?" She was quiet for a moment. Not the pause of someone deciding what to conceal. The pause of someone deciding how to be precise about something true. "We knew the vote was going to pass," she said. "We had known for about 8 months. Our diplomatic intelligence team identified the coalition being built and did the math on member state positions. When you run those numbers in that configuration, there is only one outcome. And you came anyway," I said, "knowing you would lose." "We came because losing the vote was never the thing we were worried about," she said. I thought about that. What were you worried about? She picked up her cup, held it in both hands, looked at it for a moment, with the expression of someone framing a careful answer. "We were worried about the gap between what the resolution would do on paper and what it would be able to do in practice, she said. We were worried about whether the Accord had actually thought through the dependencies before they moved forward. We were worried about the jurisdictional structure of the enforcement provisions. We were worried about whether the member states had surveyed their own supply chains carefully enough to understand what freezing human commercial activity would actually mean for their own operational continuity. She set the cup down. As it turned out, she said, they had not. You built all of that on purpose, I said. We built it because it needed building, she said. Over a long time, some of it because it was commercially sensible. Some of it because we like making things. Some of it because the people who built those structures were doing work they found interesting, and the question of whether the Accord would eventually try to exclude us was not the primary thing on their minds. She paused. But we are a species that thinks about the future, she said. We have had enough experience with being shut out of things to know that it is worth being careful about dependencies, worth not having all your supply chains run through structures that other people control, worth building redundancy in places that are not obvious. That sounds like preparation, I said. It sounds like survival, she said, which is what it is. We have been surviving a very long time. We have learned some things about how to do it. I thought about Gary Holt and his 10 years of supplier relationships. I thought about the ships distributed through the Sol system in patterns that were not quite a defensive grid. What happens now? I asked. She looked at me with that same expression I had first seen in the chamber. The one I had misread as neutrality, and then slowly understood, was something else. Now we wait, she said. The Accord will work through the implications of what they have found in their supply chain review. They will realize the scope of the dependency. They will have internal discussions about what that means for the enforcement strategy. Some of those discussions will be uncomfortable, and then, at some point, someone will reach out to our diplomatic service through an unofficial channel and ask whether there is a basis for a conversation. And then, I said, and then we will have a conversation, she said, and at the end of it, there will be a new arrangement, one that takes into account certain realities that the resolution did not adequately account for. She picked up her cup again. It will take time, she said. These things always do. But it will happen. I sat with that for a moment. You are very confident, I said. She looked at me, and for the first time since I had met her, the expression shifted into something warmer. Not quite a smile. Something just before a smile. The anticipation of one. I have been doing this for 30 years, she said, and my species has been doing it for considerably longer. I had no response to that. She finished her drink. We sat in the small cafe for a while longer and talked about other things, smaller things, the kind of conversation that builds slowly toward something and does not announce what it is building toward. When I left, I walked back through the commercial district. Gary Holt's expanded stall was busy. D. Cartwright's display had been rearranged and was showing new items that I had not seen before. The young man she had been training the other day was handling a transaction with a Dreth customer, and he was doing it well, with the calm competence of someone who has been taught by someone good. I watched them for a moment. Then I walked on. I thought about the word patience. I thought about what patience becomes when it is sustained over a very long time by a very large number of people, each doing the ordinary work of their days, building things and making connections, and establishing relationships in the steady, unremarkable way of a species that is always thinking about the future. I thought about Yara Osei's voice when she had said, "We have been surviving a very long time." Not pride in that statement, not complaint, just the plain factual tone of someone stating something true about the world they live in. We have been surviving a very long time, and we have learned some things about how to do it. I wrote my most detailed report of the period that evening. I sent it directly to the senior counsel, rather than to my immediate supervisor. I said that the preliminary analysis of Earth's response to the resolution had been based on incorrect assumptions about the scope and structure of human commercial and logistical infrastructure in Accord-adjacent space. I said that a comprehensive reassessment was required. I said that in my professional judgment, the Accord was not in the position it had believed itself to be in when the resolution was passed. Then I said something I had never said in 30 years of filing observer reports. I said, I recommend that the Accord initiate dialogue with the Terran Diplomatic Service at the earliest opportunity. Not from a position of enforcement, But from a position of genuine inquiry, there is considerably more to understand about this situation than the resolution's framing suggests. I believe the humans are prepared to have that conversation. I believe they have been prepared for longer than the Accord realizes. I sent the report. Then I sat in the quiet of my quarters and thought about Frances Cole and her pleasant voice and her patient account management team, waiting for the calls that were going to start coming. They had not started yet, but they would, very soon, because the Accord was beginning to understand the shape of what it had done. And understanding the shape of what you have done is the first step toward having a very different kind of conversation. Outside, the station turned. The ships blinked and moved and went about their business. And somewhere, in an office I had never visited, a woman poured another cup of tea and opened the next item in her correspondence queue, working through her day at exactly the pace of someone who had somewhere to be and enough time to get there. That pace. Always that pace. It was the most unsettling thing I had ever encountered, because it meant they were never rushed. And something that is never rushed is something that has already done its planning. Long before you thought to look. The Whisper campaign started on the 32nd day. I know it was a Whisper campaign because it had none of the official trappings of Accord policy. There were no formal declarations, no published communications, no statements attributed to named representatives. It moved instead through the unofficial channels that every major diplomatic body uses when it wants to apply pressure without creating a record. Through trade attachés speaking at private functions. Through second-hand conversations repeated across social networks at space stations. Through the particular kind of rumor that begins with a true thing and is shaped by repetition into something more pointed than the truth. The message was consistent wherever it appeared. Do not trade with Earth. Do not give them shelter. Do not offer them the credibility that comes from visible alliance. The Accord was watching, and how a species chose to position itself during this period would be remembered when future agreements were negotiated. It was, I will say clearly, a sophisticated piece of work. The Accord had done this before, with other species, and they understood that informal pressure applied through social and commercial networks could accomplish things that formal resolutions could not. A species that felt uncertain about the consequences of being seen to cooperate with Earth would do the Accord's work for them without requiring any enforcement action. The campaign was directed at three main targets: the Dreth Confederation, the Pale Collective, and the Singing Worlds of Era. These were the largest independent civilizations that had not signed the Terran Exclusion Resolution, species that maintained their own economic networks, and whose cooperation or refusal would significantly affect whether the embargo held. I was on Corel Station when the campaign reached the Dreth Confederation, which was my jurisdiction as an observer. I saw the Accord attaché arrive and begin his rounds. I watched him work the diplomatic social circuit with the practiced ease of someone very good at indirect communication. He did not say anything that could be quoted or reported. He implied. He suggested. He allowed silences to carry meaning that explicit statements would not. He was, from a technical standpoint, excellent at his job. What he did not know, and what I was only beginning to understand myself, was that he had arrived approximately 6 weeks after a human woman named Priya Chandrasekharan. I did not know Priya's name yet when the attaché arrived. I learned it later. But I began to understand her influence when I attended a formal dinner hosted by the Dreth High Council's trade minister and noticed, in the seating arrangement, several references to meetings and exchanges from the preceding weeks that I had not been aware of. The Dreth were an ancient species by galactic standards. They had been spacefaring for longer than humanity had been writing things down. Their political instincts were refined over centuries of careful alliance management, and their capacity for detecting when they were being managed was extraordinary. When the Accord's attaché began making his rounds, the Dreth heard exactly what he was saying, beneath what he was saying. They noted it. They filed it, and they waited. What I did not understand until I spoke with a Dreth council member named Smirked, whom I had a collegial relationship with, was that while the Accord's attaché was working the informal circuit, several members of the council had already had very different kinds of conversations over the preceding weeks. Smirked invited me to share a meal with her, which among the Dreth is a gesture of significant trust. And over the course of that meal she showed me something she described as a partial record of events she thought I might find instructive. What she showed me was documentation of 14 years of small human actions that had, in various ways and at various times, intersected with Dreth interests. They were not major political gestures. They were not formally negotiated aid packages. They were the kind of things that happen in the margins of interstellar existence. A supply run to a station during a difficult period, a technical consultation that solved a persistent problem, an engineer who had spent years on a Dreth mining installation because he found the work genuinely interesting, and who had, over those years, become someone the installation staff trusted and relied upon. The human woman who had apparently been responsible for compiling and presenting this documentation to the Dreth Council had done so, according to Sir Vreth, without any particular drama. She had arrived at the council chambers, introduced herself as a diplomatic service representative, and said that she had some materials she thought the council might find relevant, given current events, and that she wanted to share them, and then answer any questions the council had. She had not asked for anything. She had made no requests. She had not framed the conversation as an appeal for support or a pitch for alliance. She had simply shown the Dreth what humans had been quietly doing for 14 years, and let them draw their own conclusions. The Accords attaché arrived 6 weeks later. By that point, the Dreth Council had already held its internal discussions. They had looked at the documentation. They had remembered the engineer who had spent years fixing atmospheric processors because he found it interesting. They had weighed, in the careful way of a very old and very experienced civilization, the difference between a species that sent formal attachés to imply consequences and a species that had been sending, for 14 years, people who actually did useful things. The attaché did his rounds. The council was polite to him. They offered him hospitality. They listened to what he said with the attentive courtesy of people who have already made their decision and see no reason to announce it yet. He filed a report that said the Dreth appeared to be receptive to the Accord's position. That report was wrong. I know it was wrong because Sir Vreth, over our meal, told me what the council had actually decided. They had decided that the documentation the human diplomat had brought them changed nothing and confirmed everything. It changed nothing because the Dreth had always made their own decisions. It confirmed everything because what it showed them was not a calculated appeal for support. What it showed them was simply what humans had been doing when no one was watching. That is the part that matters, Sir Vreth told me. We have dealt with many species that come to us when they need something. We know what that looks like. What the humans showed us was not that. What they showed us was what they do when they are not seeking anything in return. She paused. A species that behaves generously when there is no immediate benefit, she said, is a species worth knowing. The Dreth sent the Accords attaché home with a polite statement of neutrality that, in Dreth diplomatic language, meant something significantly less neutral than it appeared. Then they sent the human diplomatic service an invitation to a formal dinner. The human diplomat, whose name I now knew was Priya Chandrasekaran, accepted. She stayed for a week. I learned later that she had done the same thing at the Pale Collective and had begun similar conversations with the Singing Worlds of Ura. In each case, arriving before the Accords attachés. In each case, bringing documentation of quiet, unannounced human activity that had touched those civilizations in small positive ways over many years. In each case, making no requests and applying no pressure, simply sharing information and then having a conversation. The Accords Whisper campaign ran for 3 months. At the end of 3 months, not one of the 3 target species had moved closer to supporting the embargo. All 3 had, in various ways and through various channels, moved in the opposite direction. I filed my report on the Dreth situation and added a note about what I had learned. I said that the Accords' informal pressure campaign had encountered a significant obstacle, the pre-existing presence of human relationship-building activity that predated the campaign by many years and that had established a basis of goodwill that the campaign's messaging could not easily overcome. I did not say what I actually felt, which was something like admiration, though not the simple kind. It was the more complicated kind that arrives when you watch something be done so well and over such a long time that you cannot find the seam where the strategy ends and the genuine character begins. Because that was the thing about what Priya Chandrasekaran had shown the Dreth. It was not a strategy, or rather, it had not started as one. The engineer who spent 8 years on the mining installation had gone there because he found it interesting, The supply run during the difficult period had happened because people needed supplies. The technical consultation had happened because someone knew how to solve a problem, and someone else had a problem. The documentation was real because the things it documented were real. And you cannot effectively counter a thing that is real by implying consequences. You can only wait and hope the other party decides that consequences matter more than reality. The Dreth, who had been navigating galactic politics for a very long time, had made their assessment of that wager. So had the Pale Collective. So, gradually, were the singing worlds of Era. The Accord's whisper campaign faded by the end of the third month, not with any formal acknowledgement of failure. These things never acknowledge failure. They simply grow quieter, and then quieter still. And then one day you realize you have not heard any new version of the message in several weeks, and the silence tells you what no announcement ever would. I walked through Corel Station on the day I understood the campaign was over, and stopped at a small vendor's display near the transit hub. The vendor was a human man named Owen Park, young, with the focused energy of someone running a new business and finding that it is going better than expected. He was selling navigational components. Some of them were specialized items that I recognized as having previously been difficult to source in this sector of the station. "Where did these come from?" I asked him, pointing to a particular type of relay calibration unit that I had not seen available locally in some time. He named a supplier I had not heard of, based at a transit station in the outer regions of a system that was not Accord affiliated. "New relationship?" I asked. "6 months old," he said. "But we have been building toward it for longer. My company has been working in that region for about 4 years. You take your time with these things. You do good work. You show up consistently. Eventually it turns into something." 4 years. He had been building that relationship for 4 years. Before the vote. Before the resolution. Before the whisper campaign or the fleet at the Soul Boundary, or the invoices from Francis Cole or any of it. I bought a component I did not need, and carried it back to my quarters. I sat with it in my hands and thought about what 4 years of consistent work looks like when you multiply it across a civilization of many billions, each person building their own small network of relationships and reliability, each one creating a thread that connects to other threads, forming over time a fabric so dense and so widely distributed that you cannot cut it by cutting any particular part of it. The Accord had tried to cut a thread. They had discovered they were looking at a fabric, and the fabric, like all fabrics of that kind, had taken a very long time to weave. That evening, I received word through the Observer Network that the Accord's Senior Council was convening an internal review of the resolution's implementation progress. The review was described in official language as a routine assessment. The review was not routine. I knew it was not routine because routine reviews are scheduled in advance and announced through normal channels. This one was called on 6 hours' notice, and the participants list was restricted to council members only. No observers, no legal staff beyond the minimum required for procedure. Something had happened that required private discussion. I spent the evening trying to work out what it was. My best guess involved the supply chain review that the Accord's Trade Administration had been conducting since the first batch of invoices. I had been watching that review from a distance for weeks, tracking it through the professional contacts I maintained in various departments, and the picture it was painting of human commercial integration into Accord logistics networks was, from what I could piece together, considerably more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Not just the quantum coherence stabilizers. Not just the relay calibration units. The more the review teams dug, the more they found. Maintenance contracts, software service agreements, specialized manufacturing operations, component supply chains running through shell companies and subsidiaries and quietly branded divisions, each one individually unremarkable, collectively representing a degree of dependency that the resolution had not accounted for. The humans had not done this all at once. They had not done it with any grand design that I could identify. They had done it in the ordinary way of a commercially energetic civilization, finding useful things to make, and useful services to offer, and good reasons to establish themselves in places where business could be done. But the cumulative effect, looked at from the perspective of a council trying to enforce an exclusion resolution, was that you could not meaningfully exclude them without creating operational problems for yourself. The review, from what I understood of its preliminary findings, was landing on this conclusion with increasing clarity. Hence, I suspected, the emergency council session. I did not have access to what was said in that session. I had access, 2 days later, to a very carefully worded memorandum that came out of it. The memorandum said that the implementation of Resolution 7741 was proceeding, and that the Accord remained committed to its terms. It said that certain technical and administrative complexities had been identified and were being assessed. It said that the Council would continue to provide updates as the review progressed. It said nothing about what the updates might contain. It did not need to. The language of technical and administrative complexities in Accord bureaucratic communication means something specific. It means we have found something we did not expect, and we are deciding what to do about it, and we are not ready to say what that thing is, or what we are going to decide. I read the memorandum 3 times. Then I wrote a brief note in my personal journal. The review is producing results that the Council did not want it to produce. The Whisper campaign has ended without achieving its objectives. The fleet at the Sol boundary has repositioned to a neutral location after an administrative dispute it was not equipped to win. The 3 major independent civilizations that were the targets of informal pressure have not moved in the direction the pressure intended. I sat with that list. It was not a small list. Each item on it represented a significant component of the strategy that the Accord had built around the resolution. Each component had encountered, in its own way, the same basic problem. A reality that differed from the assumptions the strategy was built on. The assumptions had been reasonable, from a certain perspective. They were the assumptions you make about a civilization when you look at it from the outside and see its formal structures, its declared military capacity, its official trade relationships, its visible political alignments. What you do not see, until you are already inside the situation and looking very carefully, is everything that was built below that level. The relationships formed over years of consistent, quiet work. The supply chain positions established through genuine commercial activity. The goodwill accumulated through unremarkable daily helpfulness. The redundancies built into systems because a species that has survived many difficult things has learned not to rely too heavily on any single structure. You do not see the fabric until you try to cut the thread, and by then, you are already inside the situation. I closed my journal. Outside, Corel Station continued its ordinary life. Owen Park was probably still at his display, making sales and building toward the next 4-year relationship. Somewhere, Priya Chandrasekaran was probably on a transport heading to another conversation she had prepared for longer than anyone realized. And in the Accord's council chambers, very important people were having a very uncomfortable discussion about technical and administrative complexities. That phrase, technical and administrative complexities. It would have sounded, to most people, like bureaucratic hedging. To me, having watched the past several weeks unfold, it sounded like something else. It sounded like the opening edge of a much larger realization, and realizations, once they begin, are very difficult to contain. The embargo was technically in force, but the ground it was standing on was considerably less solid than it had appeared from the chamber floor of the Grand Accord Hall. I thought about Yara Osei's voice when she had said, "We will be in touch." I thought about Alan Marsh and his administrative question about jurisdictional provisions. I thought about Frances Cole and her patient, pleasant account management team, and I thought about how long it takes, for a very large institution, to understand the shape of the situation it is actually in, versus the shape of the situation it believed itself to be in. Long enough for a species that is very good at patience to keep doing what it has always been doing, going about its business, at exactly the pace of something that has somewhere to be, and enough time to get there. The Council's review would continue. The conclusions it was moving toward would become harder to avoid, and at some point, through some channel that would be described afterward as routine, a message would be sent. Not to Yara Osei directly. These things are never done directly at first. To an intermediary, to an attaché, to someone whose name would not appear in any formal record as the person who started the conversation. But the conversation would start. Humanity knew it would start. They had known before the vote. They were simply waiting, with the particular patience of something that has been surviving difficult things for a very long time, for the moment when the other side understood it too. That moment was coming. It was, I thought, very close now. The memorandum had said technical and administrative complexities. That was close. That was the vocabulary of a large institution beginning to find its way toward the real question. The real question was not how to enforce the resolution. The real question was whether enforcing the resolution was possible without doing more damage to the enforcers than to the excluded. And the answer to that question, when the review was complete, and the numbers were on the table, and the council was in the room looking at them, was going to be very clear. I wrote one final line in my journal that night. I wrote, "The conversation will begin within 60 rotations." I underestimated slightly. It began in 41. The 41st day brought a different kind of news. Not the conversation I had predicted, something worse, something that shifted the entire structure of what was happening in a direction that none of my analysis had prepared me for, because I had been watching the wrong level of the situation. I had been watching policy, watching diplomacy, watching the slow, grinding logic of institutional decision-making. I had not been watching the thing that happens when institutions lose control of events. A transport vessel called the Nairobi Sky had departed the Sol system 11 days earlier carrying 412 passengers, colonists, families, people who had applied for and been approved for settlement positions at a new human outpost in a system at the far end of the outer reaches. The kind of expansion project that Earth had been conducting for decades as its population spread slowly outward into the available volume of space. The passengers were not government, they were not military. They were people who had packed their lives into cargo containers and were traveling to a new place to build something, in the ordinary way of a species that has been moving into new territory for as long as it has existed. The Nairobi Sky did not have a military escort because it did not have a military purpose. It was a civilian transport, fully registered, broadcasting its identification and destination on all standard frequencies, moving through a transit corridor that it had used before without incident. On the 11th day of its journey, 3 Accord warships intercepted it in neutral space. The official statement from the Accord said the interception was for inspection purposes, under the provisions of Resolution 7741. The statement said the inspection was conducted according to standard procedures. The statement said all passengers and crew were treated in accordance with Accord law and were at all times in good health. The statement did not say how long the inspection lasted. The inspection lasted 11 days. 412 people, including children, were held aboard a vessel in neutral space for 11 days, while Accord inspectors went through every piece of cargo, every personal item, every document, every data file, in a process that I was told by a source who had access to the inspection logs was not conducted with the care that the phrase "standard procedures" suggests. Nobody was hurt. The Accord was very careful about that. Nobody was physically harmed. The conditions were not comfortable, and they grew less comfortable as the days passed, and the ship's civilian supply arrangements were not designed for extended stationary operation, but the Accord could point to the absence of injury and say, as they did say, that the passengers were at all times in good health. What they could not say, and did not try to say, was that holding 400 people including families with children in an unplanned 11-day detention in neutral space, because their transport happened to be leaving Earth at a moment when the Accord wanted to demonstrate enforcement capability, was something other than what it was. I found out about the Nairobi Sky from a news feed on the 41st day, the same day I had predicted a conversation would begin, the same day I was sitting at my desk, composing an updated observer report with a certain amount of professional satisfaction at my own predictive accuracy. I stopped composing the report. I read the news item twice. Then I did something I had never done in my career as an observer. I closed my official work entirely, closed every professional window on my screen, and sat for a while doing nothing. 412 people. Families. Held for 11 days. I thought about the Accord's statement with its careful language about standard procedures and good health. I thought about what it feels like to be a child on a transport that has stopped moving and is surrounded by warships and is not going anywhere for 11 days. I thought about the gap between the statement and the reality, and the kind of calculation that produces an action, and then reaches for language to describe it as something other than the action it was. Then I thought about the human diplomatic service, and I thought about what comes next. Because here is what I had understood, across the preceding weeks of careful observation. Humans are a species of enormous patience. They will endure things that would break other civilizations. They will wait through discomfort and setback and institutional frustration with the steadiness of something that has decided the long game is worth playing. They will answer fleet deployments with jurisdictional questions. They will respond to whisper campaigns by having already been there 6 weeks earlier. They will receive an embargo with an invoice. But there is a register of action that bypasses all of that. There is a kind of thing that does not trigger patience. It triggers something else. Something older. I had read enough human history to have a sense of what that something was. Every species has its lines, the things that cross from political challenge to something more fundamental. For humans, the line was not where I had initially expected it. They would tolerate enormous pressure applied to themselves. They had, in fact, tolerated quite a lot of it over the preceding weeks, without any escalation. The Nairobi sky was not pressure applied to Earth. The Nairobi sky was 412 people, including children, held in space, because they were human, and were leaving Earth, and someone wanted to send a message. I sat at my desk and thought about what I knew of human history. I thought about the patterns, the long patience and then the moment when the patience stops, the careful negotiation and then the thing that ends the negotiation, the diplomatic restraint and then the event that renders diplomacy secondary. I thought about what Yara Osei's face would look like when she heard about the Nairobi sky. Not the smirk, not the folded hands and the patient calm. Something I had not seen from her yet. Something that, I suspected, the Accord had never seen from any human diplomat in the kind of formal setting where things are decided. I was wrong about that, as it turned out. I was right about something else. The Accord's senior council was meeting when the news of the Nairobi sky became public. I know this because I had sources inside that building, and because the pattern of communications coming out of the council chambers over the following hours told a clear story about the internal situation. The warship commanders who had conducted the interception had acted, according to the official position, under Standing Accord Enforcement Authority. The resolution authorized inspection of human vessels in transit through Accord-adjacent space. The Nairobi sky had been in such space. The inspection had been conducted accordingly. What the official position did not address was whether the resolution's authorization for inspection of commercial cargo vessels extended to passenger transports, whether the 11-day duration was proportionate under any reasonable interpretation of inspection, whether the decision to intercept a civilian transport carrying families, rather than, for instance, waiting for a vessel with an actual commercial cargo to inspect, had been made with any particular strategic purpose, or had been made because 3 warship commanders had been frustrated for 6 weeks and had found an opportunity to do something visible. I do not know which of those things it was. I know what happened afterward. The Nairobi sky passengers were released on the 42nd day. The release came with a statement of regret from the Accord Secretariat, language so carefully constructed that it acknowledged a procedural concern without conceding that anything had been done wrong. The statement also contained a reaffirmation that Resolution 7741 remained in full force and that the Accord was committed to its implementation. The Terran Diplomatic Service received the statement. They sent a response. The response was not what the Accord expected. It was not angry. It was not emotional. It was not a declaration or a warning or anything that could be characterized as a dramatic escalation. It was a document. 214 pages, prepared in the formal style of Accord legal procedure, addressed to the full Council and all member states simultaneously, filed through the official channels, and also sent directly to the diplomatic services of every independent civilization in the galaxy, including the Dreth Confederation, the Pale Collective, and the Singing Worlds of Era. The document was titled, A Record of Accord Obligations and Accounting. It listed, in precise and extensively sourced legal language, every treaty provision that the Accord had violated in its conduct toward Earth going back to first contact, not just the Nairobi sky, every incursion into Terran space without notification, every trade agreement that had been applied asymmetrically, every regulatory decision that had treated human vessels differently from Accord member vessels in equivalent situations. Every time the Accord had made decisions affecting human interests without the procedural consultations that its own charter required. It went back decades. Some items were small, some were large. Each was sourced to primary documentation. Each was described in language that a legal analyst could verify and a general reader could understand. The document did not ask for anything. It did not make demands. It did not issue ultimatums. It did not threaten. It simply recorded, with perfect accuracy, over 214 pages, what had actually happened over the course of Earth's relationship with the Galactic Accord. And then it invited responses, should any member states wish to contest the record. Colin Reeve had been carrying a notepad and a real pen the day of the vote. I understood now what he had been writing. He had been making notes about things he already knew. The document had not been assembled in the weeks since the vote. It had been assembled over years. The vote had been the occasion to file it. The Nairobi Sky had been the occasion to distribute it widely. The Accord's Senior Council received the document and held an emergency session that lasted, according to what I could gather from my sources, for 9 hours. At the end of those 9 hours, 3 things happened. First, the Accord Secretariat issued a statement that the document had been received and was under review. Second, the 3 warship commanders who had conducted the Nairobi Sky interception were recalled to Kithani territory for an administrative review of their conduct. Third, and most significantly, the fleet currently positioned at the Helios relay point, Admiral Genyura's 17 warships, received new orders. They were told to stand down from active enforcement posture and maintain a monitoring position only. Stand down, not withdrawal. The Accord was careful about the language, but monitoring position only, in military communication, means you are present but not acting, which in the context of an enforcement operation means you have stopped enforcing. I sat with that for a long time. The Accord had not officially suspended the resolution. They could not do that without a full council vote, and they were not ready for that. But they had quietly, without announcement, stopped pushing on the enforcement mechanisms. They had encountered the 214 pages. They had encountered the Nairobi Sky's release and the statement of regret. They had encountered the document being sent to every independent civilization in the galaxy. And they had decided, with the institutional wisdom of a very old and experienced body, that the moment to push harder was not now. The moment to push harder is never now, when you have just discovered that the ground you are standing on is not what you thought it was. I went to find Yara Osei. She was in the same cafe, same table, same cup of something warm. She looked, to a casual observer, exactly as she had looked the last time I sat across from her. Patient, still, entirely unruffled. I knew her well enough by now to see what lay underneath that. The document, I said, sitting down. The document, she agreed. Colin Reeve has been building it for years, I said. Colin has been building it for 11 years, she said. He started when he was 28. He thought it was important to have a complete record. He was right, I said. He usually is, she said. He is very thorough. I thought about a 28-year-old human legal attaché deciding, 11 years ago, to start documenting every treaty obligation the Accord had ever violated in its dealings with Earth. Not because anything particular had happened at that time, not because a confrontation was imminent, simply because it seemed like important information to have, carefully recorded, in case it ever became relevant. Did you always know this was coming? I asked. The resolution, the exclusion. She held her cup in both hands and considered the question seriously. We knew it was possible, she said. We have known it was possible for a long time. The Accord has always had members who were uncomfortable with the pace and direction of human expansion. The coalition that produced Resolution 7741 did not form overnight. It formed over many years, and we were watching it form. And you prepared, I said. We continued doing what we were already doing, she said, while also being mindful that some of what we were doing had value beyond its immediate purpose. She set the cup down. The supply chain work was commercially sensible, she said. Gary Holt's relationships with his suppliers were professionally valuable. Priya's 14 years of building connections in the Dreth Confederation and elsewhere were done because she cared about those relationships. Colin's document was built because Colin believes in accurate records. She paused. None of it was done primarily as a preparation for this, but all of it was done by people who understood, in the background of their professional lives, that knowing your situation clearly is always better than not knowing it, and that a species with our history would be foolish not to maintain its options. Your history, I said, of exclusion. She looked at me directly. Of being told that we were not welcome somewhere, she said, and discovering that the people doing the telling had not fully considered whether they could make that stick. There it was. The thing underneath all of it. Not a strategy born from this particular conflict, a disposition born from something much older, a species that had spent a very long time being pushed toward edges and discovering, each time, that the edges were not where the pushers thought they were. What happens now? I asked. Now the council does its review, she said. The document will produce certain uncomfortable recognitions. The Nairobi sky will produce others. The supply chain assessment will have been completed by now, and the results will be on the council table. And then, I said, and then someone, probably not anyone whose name you will recognize, will make contact through a channel that does not appear in any official record, and they will say that there may be a basis for a preliminary conversation about implementation challenges, and would the Terran Diplomatic Service be interested in exploring whether those challenges could be addressed through dialogue. She said all of this in the same tone that someone uses to describe something they have watched happen before. And you will say yes, I said. We will express appropriate openness, she said, and there was the faintest warmth in it, the nearest thing to humor I had heard from her in our conversations. On your terms, I said. In a configuration that reflects the current realities, she said, which are not the realities that the resolution was written around. I thought about the 214 pages. I thought about the 3 warship commanders being recalled for administrative review. I thought about the fleet at the Helios relay point, standing down to monitoring position only. I thought about the informal message that was going to come through an unnamed channel. You knew all of this when you walked out of the chamber, I said. The day of the vote. She was quiet for a moment. We knew the shape of it, she said. Not every specific. Not the Nairobi sky, which was an action taken by individuals who made a bad choice, and which made things move faster than they might have otherwise. But the general shape, yes. That is why you were not distressed, I said. I was not distressed, she said, because I knew that the distance between the vote and a different conversation was not as large as the vote was meant to suggest. She picked up her cup. We have been here before, she said. Not exactly here. Not this specific situation, but the general shape of it, told that we are not welcome. Told that the decision has been made, and the outcome is determined. Finding that the outcome is rather more complicated than the decision anticipated, she drank. You develop a certain familiarity with that shape, she said. Over enough time. I walked back to my quarters through the commercial district. Owen Park was at his expanded display, talking to a new customer. Gary Holt was at his stall with a queue of people waiting for his attention. D. Cartwright's young assistant was handling the front of the display with the calm competence of someone who has been doing the work long enough to have stopped thinking about the work. I watched them for a moment. Then I went to my desk. I did not write a report. I wrote in my personal journal. I wrote, "The resolution is technically in force. The fleet has stood down from enforcement posture. The document is in distribution. The conversation will begin soon." And then I wrote the thing I had been building toward for weeks without quite knowing it. I wrote, "I do not think humanity was ever in danger. Not because they are stronger than the Accord. Not because they had a secret weapon, or a hidden fleet, or a plan that was cleverer than the opposition's. Not because of any single thing. Because of the sum of all the small things. Gary and his 10-year supplier relationships. Priya and her 14 years of quiet connection building. Colin and his 11 years of careful documentation. Frances Cole and her pleasant, patient account management team. The engineer on the Dreth mining installation who found it interesting. The supply run during the difficult period. The technical consultation that solved a persistent problem. Owen Park and his 6-month relationship that had been 4 years in the building. None of it was a strategy. All of it, accumulated, was something harder to dismantle than any strategy. It was a civilization that had learned, over a very long time, that the way you survive in a complicated universe is not primarily by being powerful enough to resist what comes at you. It is by building, steadily and genuinely and in all directions, so many real connections and useful things that removing you from the structure of the world costs the world more than it costs you. And doing that, and doing that, and doing that, until the doing of it is not a plan, but simply how you live. The Accord had voted to exclude a civilization. They had not noticed, until it was too late to matter, that the civilization was already woven through the fabric of the thing they were trying to exclude it from. Not by force, by showing up, day after day, decade after decade, doing the work, being useful, being there. I closed the journal. Outside, the station turned. Somewhere in an unnamed channel, someone was composing a message that would not appear in any official record, but would be the beginning of a very different kind of conversation. And somewhere, in a small cafe near the commercial district of Corel Station, a woman named Yara Osei was probably finishing her drink and thinking about what came next. With the particular patience of a species that has been here before, and knows exactly where here ends. The message came through on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday, because I had adopted, in a strange fit of cultural assimilation that I did not fully notice happening, the human practice of organizing my week according to their day names. Most species on Vorith Station use the standard accord rotation cycle for scheduling. The humans use their own system, and I had been spending enough time around them that their vocabulary had begun to colonize my own internal sense of time. Tuesday, early in what they would call the morning watch. Before most of the commercial district had opened its stalls, the message was sent from the personal communication device of a Senari trade counselor named Pel Voss, who was not, as far as any official record was concerned, involved in Accord diplomatic affairs. He was a commercial liaison. His work was the negotiation of trade terms between Senari manufacturing interests and various partners across the sector. His name appeared nowhere in the documentation surrounding Resolution 7741. He sent the message to Alan Marsh. Alan Marsh, I had learned by this point, was not actually a deputy attaché in any meaningful sense. He was the kind of person who carries a minor title and does significant work, which is a more common arrangement than most institutional observers acknowledge. He had been with the Terran Diplomatic Service for 19 years. He had a reputation, among the small community of people who were aware of his existence, for knowing exactly what a situation was and exactly what it was not, and for speaking with equal precision about both. The message from Pel Voss said that he had become aware of certain discussions within Accord administrative circles regarding the implementation of current trade policy, and that he understood the Terran Diplomatic Service might have perspectives on those discussions that could be productively shared in an informal context, and that he would be pleased to host a small private dinner at his suite on Vorith Station, if such a conversation was of interest. Alan Marsh replied within 4 hours. He said that dinner sounded very pleasant. I know all of this because, by this point in my assignment, I had built a network of contacts and sources that I will not describe in any detail, but that gave me visibility into a range of communications that my official access did not cover. I want to be clear that I used this network responsibly, and that everything I learned through it has been used only for legitimate observer purposes. I also want to be clear that I had been building that network, in my own small way, in the same manner that Gary Holt built his supplier relationships, and Priya Chandrasekaran built her Dreth connections. One careful conversation at a time, over a long period, with no particular endpoint in mind. Perhaps the humans had been more influence on me than I realized. The dinner at Pel Voss's suite was attended by 7 people. Pel Voss, Alan Marsh, 2 Accord trade administrators whose names I will not include here because their participation was not supposed to be on any record, a Cathani legal advisor named Sorvel, who had extensive experience with treaty interpretation, a Dreth diplomat, attached to their neutral observer mission, who was there in what everyone agreed would be described as a personal capacity, and a woman named Laura Finch, who was introduced as a trade consultant and who, as I later confirmed, was a senior analyst at the Terran Diplomatic Service's Strategic Assessment Division. I was not at the dinner, but I know what was discussed, because 2 of the people present trusted me enough to tell me afterward, separately, in conversations I received with appropriate professional discretion. The conversation began with acknowledgments that could not be official. Pel Voss said that he had become concerned, in his commercial capacity, about certain disruptions to supply chains in the sector. The 2 Accord trade administrators expressed similar concerns. Sorvel said that treaty interpretation was a complex matter, and that there was sometimes value in exploring how provisions might be understood in light of actual circumstances, rather than theoretical ones. Alan Marsh listened to all of this with the expression that I now understood was his professional default: calm, attentive, entirely without the anxiety that other people's diplomatic hedging tends to produce in its recipients. Then Laura Finch spoke. She did not hedge. This was, I gathered, deliberate. The situation had arrived at the point where hedging was costing more time than it saved, and time had costs of its own. She laid out, in clear and precise language, what the Terran government's position was. Not the official position, which everyone in the room had read, the actual position, what Earth wanted out of the current situation, and what Earth was prepared to offer in exchange for it. What Earth wanted was simple: full restoration of transit rights, trade access, and diplomatic status, with new treaty language that codified certain protections that had not existed before, and that the 214-page document had demonstrated were necessary. What Earth was prepared to offer in exchange was also simple: continued operation of the commercial and logistical infrastructure that the Supply Chain Review had identified as critical to Accord member operations, under terms that were fair to both parties, plus technical assistance programs in several areas where human expertise was genuinely useful to species that had not developed it independently. Not a concession, not a surrender, a trade. The Cathani legal advisor, Sorvel, said that restoring Earth's status would require a full council vote. Laura Finch said that she was aware of that. Sorvel said that such a vote would be difficult to arrange given the political circumstances. Laura Finch said that she was aware of that too, and that she had prepared some thoughts on how the procedural pathway might work. She had prepared quite a lot of thoughts, organized into a document that she provided to the group, which walked through the specific procedural steps by which the Accord Council could revisit and amend Resolution 7741, without requiring the kind of public acknowledgement of failure that would make the process politically untenable for the member states that had voted for it most enthusiastically. There was a mechanism, buried in the Accord's own procedural charter, existing there because complex institutions always develop mechanisms for reversing decisions that have turned out to be wrong without looking like they are reversing decisions that have turned out to be wrong. Laura Finch had found it. She had found it because Colin Reeve had catalogued everything, and she had been given access to everything he had catalogued. The document was 2 pages long. 2 pages, after months of what had looked like intractable conflict. The conversation continued for 4 hours. I am told it was, for most of that time, surprisingly pleasant. Pelvos served good food. Alan Marsh had brought a bottle of something human that he shared around the table, and that was apparently very well received. The Dreth diplomat told a story at some point that made the Cathani legal advisor laugh, which I am told was a sound nobody in the room had heard a Cathani make before. By the end of the evening, nobody had agreed to anything official. But everybody understood what the agreement was going to be, and everybody understood the path to it. I heard about the dinner the following morning, and spent the day processing what it meant. The formal process that Laura Finch's 2-page document described would take approximately 3 months to complete. There would be committee reviews, legal assessments, member state consultations conducted through back channels before anything official was proposed. There would be carefully worded resolutions that amended rather than repealed, preserved rather than dismantled, offered every member state an easy narrative about procedural refinement rather than policy reversal. It would look, from the outside, like the Accord refining its approach to a complex situation. It would be, in reality, the Accord acknowledging that the approach had been wrong. Not in those words. Never in those words. Institutions do not speak in those words, but in the outcome, which was what actually mattered. I walked through the commercial district that afternoon with a feeling that I was still working to name precisely. It was not satisfaction, exactly. It was not relief. It was something closer to the feeling you get when you have been watching a very long story and you finally understand the structure of it, the beginning and the middle and the shape of the ending, and how each part was necessary to produce the next part. The beginning was the vote. The middle was everything that came after: the invoices, the fleet, the whisper campaign, the document, the Nairobi sky, the dinner. The ending was the 2-page procedural document that Laura Finch had set on a table in Pelvos's suite, and underneath all of it, running through the whole structure like a thread that had been there from the start, was the same pattern. Humans doing the ordinary work of their lives, building things and making connections and showing up consistently, and that pattern, accumulated across many billions of people over many decades, producing something that no vote could actually remove. Because you cannot vote to remove something that is already part of the thing you are using to vote with. That is the lesson. Not, humans are stronger than you think. Not, do not make enemies of Earth. Those framings miss the point entirely. The point is simpler and stranger, and more difficult to fully absorb. The point is that a civilization which spends long enough just being genuinely present and genuinely useful becomes, over time, part of the structure of everything around it. Not because it set out to. Not because it planned the infiltration. Because presence, real and sustained, leaves traces. And enough traces, accumulated, becomes something that you cannot remove without removing the thing it has become part of. The Accord had tried to remove Earth from the galactic community. They had discovered that Earth was in the galactic community, the way that load-bearing walls are in a building, quietly, without announcement, holding something up. You can choose to remove a load-bearing wall, but you should very carefully consider what it was bearing before you do. The Council had considered it. They had looked at the supply chain review and Francis Cole's invoices and the 214 pages, and the fleet standing down at Helios and the Dreth and the Pale Collective, and the singing worlds of Era, all declining to move in the direction they had been pushed. They had considered what they were holding up, and in a suite on Vorith Station, over good food and something human in a bottle, the process of putting it back had begun. That evening, I received an unusual message. It was from Priya Chandrasekharan, whom I had heard about extensively but never met. She said she had heard from Yara Ose that I was a careful observer, and that she thought I might find the attached report interesting. The attachment was a summary of the relationship-building work she had conducted over the preceding decade, in the Dreth Confederation and elsewhere. It was written in the practical style of a field report, but with a personal quality that official documents rarely have, as though she had written it primarily to think through what she had learned, rather than to communicate it to anyone in particular. The last paragraph said this: "The most consistent thing I found, in all of it, was that the species we spent time with were not primarily responding to what we said. They were responding to what we did when we were not saying anything." The Dreth engineer remembered not the policy statement, but the colleague who showed up when a system failed at the worst possible hour. The Pale Collective liaison remembered not the formal proposal, but the afternoon when a human medic spent 3 hours helping her understand a medical problem she had not been able to get clear answers on anywhere else. The things that built real trust were always the small things. The things done because they needed doing, not because they were part of a plan. I am not sure we planned any of this. I am not sure planning it would have worked. I think what made it work was that it was real. We were actually there. We actually cared. And that, over enough time, is something that cannot be manufactured or replicated by a campaign or an initiative. It is just what you are. I read that 3 times. I thought about Gary Holt and his 12 orders and his settled opinion. I thought about Owen Park and his 6-month relationship that had been 4 years in the building. I thought about the Dreth council member who had told me that a species which behaves generously when there is no immediate benefit is a species worth knowing. I thought about the engineer on the mining installation, fixing atmospheric processors because he found it interesting. Just what you are. Not a strategy, not a performance. Just what you are. I wrote back to Priya and thanked her for sharing the report. Then I went to bed. For the first time in weeks, I slept well. I dreamed, as best I can reconstruct it, about a fabric. Very large, very old, woven from threads of every description, some thick and obvious, some so fine you could barely see them, and running through it, in no particular pattern, present in every section, part of the structure of the whole thing. Threads that were human. So many threads. So many more than anyone had thought to count. The scholar who broke was named Prellis Vor. He was the Accord's most respected xenosociologist, which is a discipline concerned with understanding how different civilizations behave under various pressures, how they organize themselves, how they respond to challenge, and where their limits lie. He had spent 40 years building a reputation for precise, unsentimentally accurate analysis of the species he studied. His work on the Dreth migration patterns was considered definitive. His analysis of the Pale Collective's decision-making structures was still taught in academic programs across the sector. He had been commissioned, shortly after the vote, to produce a comprehensive assessment of Earth. The purpose was straightforward. Understand humanity well enough to identify where to apply pressure, what would make them yield, how long it would take. The kind of analysis that informs strategy, the kind that tells you where the wall is thin. He worked on it for 4 months. I met him by accident, 3 days before his report was submitted, in the research library on Vorith Station. He was sitting at a terminal in one of the private reading alcoves, with an expression I had never seen on a Cathani scholar's face before. They are a composed people by nature, especially the academic variety. They cultivate a particular quality of professional distance that lets them study the worst and best of galactic history without it writing itself on their faces. Preless Vor looked as though something had written itself quite thoroughly on his face and was refusing to be removed. I sat down across from him. We were acquainted in the way that people are acquainted when they have been in the same professional community for years without ever having a significant conversation. He looked at me in the way that someone looks at a familiar face when they need to talk to someone, and the familiar face will do. "You have been observing the humans closely," he said. "For several months, yes," I said. "And before that?" "I have been an observer in regions with human activity for most of my career," I said. "They were always present in various ways." He looked back at his terminal. On the screen, I could see columns of data, population records, historical timelines, event catalogs. "I have been studying them," he said, "for this report." "I know," I said. "What have you found?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Do you know what a breaking point is?" he said. "In my field, specifically, the technical concept." I said I had a general understanding. "A breaking point is the threshold past which a civilization's willingness to sustain a course of action collapses," he said. "It is the point at which the cost exceeds the perceived benefit and the organism changes direction. Every civilization has one. Every organism has one. It is a universal property of systems that exist under pressure." "Yes," I said. "I cannot find Earths," he said. He said it the way a person says something that they have been saying to themselves for a while, and finally have to say out loud to make it real. "In 40 years of this work," he said, "I have never encountered that before. I have analyzed civilizations that had very high thresholds. I have analyzed species that were remarkably resilient under sustained adverse conditions. I have always been able to identify the breaking point, not always precisely, not always with certainty about the specific mechanism, but the existence of the threshold is always present in the data." He pulled up a chart on his terminal. Long timelines, historical events mapped against what I recognized as indicators of civilizational stress and response. "I mapped their entire recorded history," he said. "Every major adverse event, every period of sustained crisis. External pressure, internal collapse, environmental catastrophe, resource scarcity, contact with hostile civilizations, all of it." He looked at the chart. "The pattern I would expect to see is periods of resilience, followed by adaptation, followed by some form of accommodation, with the limiting factor. Organisms that encounter a wall long enough eventually find a way around it, or find a way to live with the wall, or they stop encountering the wall because they stop trying to move in that direction." "And instead?" I said. "Instead," he said, "what I see is, encounter the wall, apply pressure. The wall does not move. Apply more pressure. Record the experience. Develop new methods. Apply those methods. Wait. Try again. Develop more methods. Wait some more. Eventually move through, or around, or over the wall. Document everything. Teach the next generation what was learned. Do not repeat the approach that failed. Find a new approach." He paused. "And then encounter the next wall," he said, "and do the same thing." I said nothing. "This pattern," he said, "does not have a breaking point in any meaningful sense. It has setbacks. It has failures. It has periods of enormous cost, but it does not have a point at which the organism concludes that the wall cannot be passed." He closed the chart. "I wrote the first 3 drafts of this report," he said, "looking for a way to frame the analysis in terms the Commission would find useful. They wanted to know where to apply pressure, where Earth would yield, how to make the exclusion resolution stick." He looked at me. "I cannot write that report," he said, "because the answer to the question they are asking is not available. Not because I have failed to look carefully enough, Because I have looked as carefully as 40 years of this work allows, and the answer that exists in the data is, I do not know what would actually stop them. I am not sure the concept applies in the way the Commission intends. The reading alcove was very quiet. What will you write? I asked. What the data says, he said, which will not be what the Commission wants. But I cannot write something that misrepresents the data. That is not what I am here to do. He did write what the data said. The report was submitted and, I learned later, was reviewed at the senior council level, and then quietly filed away in a restricted archive, where it would not be easily accessed by member states who might find its conclusions alarming. But nothing that is written goes nowhere. Ideas have a way of moving, especially when they are precisely and honestly formulated. I know the report moved because I heard echoes of it in conversations over the following weeks. A trade administrator who seemed to be reconsidering a position. A military advisor who said something in a public session that contained a specific kind of uncertainty I recognized. The Cathani legal advisor Sorvel, at the second dinner that Pel Voss hosted, which I also was not at but also heard about, who said something about the importance of ensuring that any new treaty framework was realistic about the actual capacities of all parties. Realistic about the actual capacities of all parties. That phrase. It came directly, I was almost certain, from the conclusion of Prellis Vor's report, which said, in its careful academic language, that any enforcement strategy premised on finding and exploiting humanity's breaking point would need to reckon with the possibility that the breaking point does not exist in a form that the strategy can reach. Realistic about the actual capacities of all parties. It is a modest-sounding phrase, the kind of thing that sounds like a procedural observation until you sit with it long enough to hear what it is actually saying. What it is saying is, we have looked at what we are dealing with, we have looked carefully and honestly, and we need to acknowledge that the approach we took was built on a map of the territory that does not match the territory as it actually is. That is a significant thing for a large and proud institution to say, even indirectly, even filtered through the careful language of procedural adjustment. It is the beginning of something honest. I went to see Prellis Vor one more time, a week after the dinner, before he left Vorith Station to return to Cathani space for the next stage of his career. He was more composed than when I had last seen him. The expression on his face had settled into something that was not quite resolution and not quite peace, but had elements of both. The expression of someone who has said the true thing and is living with the consequences of having said it. Will you study them again? I asked. I think, he said, that studying them has become unavoidable. They are in everything. The more you look, the more you find them. He gathered his documents. My colleague resigned from the project, he said. When she read the historical section, the part about the sustained adverse periods, she said she found it too difficult to process from an academic distance. What did she find difficult? I asked. He thought about this. The consistency, he said. Not the strength, not the power. The consistency. The fact that across 400,000 years of recorded history, the response to difficulty is always the same. Document. Learn. Try a new approach. Try again. Do not stop. He put the last document in his case. She said, he continued, that it was the most frightening thing she had ever read. Not because they are dangerous, but because you cannot exhaust something that does not know how to exhaust. He closed the case. I told her, he said, that I thought frightening was perhaps not the right frame. I told her I thought it was more like standing next to a river. A river is not frightening. It does not intend anything. It simply goes where it goes, and does not stop going there. He looked at me. But you should not build a dam, he said, and then act surprised when you see how much water is behind it. He left Vorith Station the next morning. I thought about his river for a long time afterward. I thought about the dam the Accord had built, and what they had discovered when they looked at how much water was behind it. Not a threat. Not a weapon. Just water. Going where it goes. Not stopping. I had been watching that water for months now. One conversation at a time. One stall in the commercial district at a time. One Francis Cole at a time. One Gary Holt and Priya Chandrasekaran and Alan Marsh, and Laura Finch, and Colin Reeve at a time. Each of them, just a person, doing the work of their days. Together, 400,000 years deep, something that had worn through every wall it had ever encountered. Not because it was trying to wear through them, because it was water. And water, given enough time, does not ask permission. It finds the way through. It always finds the way through. 3 days after Prellis Vor left, I attended a session of the Accord's Procedural Committee, which was considering a routine administrative matter relating to treaty implementation standards. The resolution that came out of that session contained, in its middle sections, language about enhanced consultation processes for member states during implementation of major trade resolutions. It was phrased as a procedural improvement. It was, in practice, the first formal document that created a mechanism by which the Accord's relationship with Earth could be addressed through a different channel than the one Resolution 7741 had established. Laura Finch's 2-page document, operationalized. I recognized it immediately. I wonder if anyone else in the room did. Probably some of them did. The ones who had been at the dinner. The ones who had read Prellis Vor's report before it was filed away. The ones who had seen the supply chain analysis and understood what it was telling them. The ones who had realized, in their different ways and at their different paces, that the territory did not match the map. They sat in that session and voted for the procedural improvement and did not say anything that acknowledged what they were actually doing. That is how large institutions change course. Not with declarations, not with reversals, with procedural improvements. I voted as an observer, which meant I recorded my position without affecting the outcome. I recorded, noted. Then I went back to the commercial district and found Owen Park at his display, helping a customer sort through relay components, explaining something in the patient detail of someone who enjoys what they know and enjoys sharing it. I watched him for a while. Then I went to find Gary Holt. I bought another component I did not need. I was building a small collection of them at this point. Gary noticed. "You keep buying things you do not have a use for," he said. "I know," I said. "Why?" I thought about it. "I think," I said. "I am learning to do what you do." He looked at me with that expression, the one of someone who has been doing this for long enough to see it clearly. "Which part?" he said. "Show up," I said. "Build something. Come back tomorrow." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up a component from his display and set it on the counter between us. "You might as well start with something useful then," he said. "This one is what you actually need for the terminal relay in a Sonari observer station. The ones you have been buying will not do the job." I looked at it. "How did you know I needed that?" I said. "You told me what kind of station you were in 3 months ago," he said. I remembered. He had been remembering, across 3 months of casual conversation, a detail I had mentioned once, and then forgotten I had mentioned. That is what it looks like. That is what it actually looks like, in the small daily version of it. You remember the thing. You show up. You come back tomorrow. Across enough time, across enough people, each of them doing it in their own small daily way, it becomes something that a 4,000-vote resolution cannot dismantle, because the 4,000 votes cannot reach down to the level where it actually lives. I paid for the component. I thanked Gary. I walked back through the station toward my quarters, and I thought about water, going where it goes, not stopping, always finding the way through. The procedural committee had voted that morning. The dam had a new crack in it, not from any single action, from the weight of everything behind it, from 400,000 years of water. The ceremony was not called a ceremony. It was called a renewal of transit accord and administrative alignment, which is the kind of title that large institutions invent when they need to do something significant while appearing to do something routine. The formal session was scheduled on a Wednesday morning, which I knew because I had fully committed to the human calendar by then, and took place in the Grand Accord Hall on Vorith Station, the same chamber where, not quite a year earlier, 4,718 species had voted to exclude Earth from the galactic community. The chamber looked the same. The elevated central platform where Vreth Sul stood was the same platform. The circular table was the same table. The recycled air had the same quality of a space that has hosted a great many serious human and non-human decisions, absorbing something of each one into its walls. The difference was the mood. In my career, I have learned to read the mood of a diplomatic gathering, the way certain species read weather, by small atmospheric signs, the angles at which bodies are held, the character of the silences, whether people are looking at each other, or at the floor, or at some neutral middle point. The mood at the vote had been the mood of an outcome that had already been decided and was being formally announced. Certain, directed. The mood of people who believed they had established control of the situation. The mood of this session was different. Not humble exactly. Large institutions do not do humility, but careful, precise. The mood of people who have spent the preceding months revising their understanding of the situation and have arrived at a new map and are being very deliberate about how they proceed with it. Yara Osei entered at the front of Earth's delegation. Same pace, same plain dark suit, same gray-templed hair. Colin Reeve was behind her with his notepad under his arm. Alan Marsh was in the delegation. Laura Finch was there too, which technically stretched the definition of a diplomatic delegation, but which nobody raised a procedural concern about, because nobody wanted to be the one to raise a procedural concern with the person who had written the 2-page document. I was in the observer section. I had been in that section for the duration of this entire assignment, and I had, over the course of it, come to understand that the observer section is an excellent place to see what is actually happening, precisely because it is not where decisions are made. You see the decisions, and you see the people making them, and you see the gap between the two. And that gap is where the truth of any situation lives. Vrthsul called the session to order. He read the formal title of the agenda item. He said that the Accord was present today to adopt a renewed framework for transit rights and trade relations that incorporated recent administrative reviews and consultation outcomes. He did not say what the recent administrative reviews had found. He did not say what the consultations had produced. He used the word incorporate rather than reverse, or correct, or any of the other verbs that would have been accurate. He used the phrase renewed framework rather than replacement of the previous framework, even though that is what it was. This is how large institutions use language. I have spent my career learning to translate it. What he was saying, translated, we are undoing what we did a year ago and replacing it with something that reflects what we should have done a year ago. And we are going to describe this as an administrative evolution, because that is how we get 4,718 member states to agree to it, without any of them having to publicly acknowledge that they were wrong. The framework was, in its actual content, nearly everything Earth had asked for at that dinner in Pelvos's suite. Full restoration of transit rights, trade access at previous levels, with new provisions that established clearer protections for human commercial interests than had existed before. Diplomatic status fully restored, with additional language that codified consultation rights that the old framework had left implicit. There were also the new provisions that had no precedent in the previous arrangement. They were described as mutual support provisions and technical cooperation frameworks. In practice, they formalized what already existed, the commercial and logistical relationships that human businesses had built across the Accord's operational network, now with contractual protection and agreed pricing structures and dispute resolution mechanisms. Francis Cole's account management team had been involved in drafting those provisions. I had that information from a source I will not describe. The document was long. Reading it aloud, as Accord procedure required, took over an hour. I sat in the observer section and listened to every word, and I noted the places where the language shifted subtly from the old framework's phrasing, the small insertions and additions that, if you knew what you were looking at, told the story of what had actually happened over the preceding year. When Vrthsul finished reading, he paused in the way that he paused before asking for responses. He looked at the human table. Ambassador Osei, he said, does the Terran delegation wish to respond? Yara Osei pressed her communication pad. The Terran delegation accepts the renewed framework, she said, and thanks the Accord for its diligence in reviewing the administrative concerns that were identified during the preceding period. Administrative concerns. I almost laughed. The preceding period had included invoices and fleet deployments, and a whisper campaign, and a 214-page legal document, and the Nairobi sky, and a scholar who could not find the breaking point, and a river that had not stopped moving since before most of the species in the room had developed writing. Administrative concerns. That is what it was called. That is how it entered the record. I thought about Prelis Vor and his river. I thought about the dam and its crack. I thought about the weight of the water behind it. Administrative concerns. The vote proceeded. The new framework was adopted by the required majority. Not unanimously. 47 member states voted against or abstained, which represented the species that had built the most ideological investment in the original resolution and found it hardest to walk back from. Their opposition was noted. It changed nothing. The session was adjourned. I remained in the observer section for a few minutes after most people had filed out, looking at the chamber in its emptied state. The circular table, the central platform, the same air, a different document on the record. A junior attaché from the Scenari Observer mission came and sat next to me. He was young, new to the posting, still at the stage where the gap between what the official process said was happening and what was actually happening was visible enough to be confusing. "I don't understand it," he said, which was not the opening I had expected. "What specifically?" I said. "Any of it," he said. "They tried to shut Earth out of everything. Embargo, fleet, all of it. It didn't work. Now they're signing a better deal than the one Earth had before." What was the point? I thought about how to answer that. I thought about a year of observation and the things I had learned during it. "The point," I said, "was that it seemed like the right thing to do at the time, to the people who did it." "But it was not," he said. "No," I said, "it was not." He was quiet for a moment. "Why not?" he said. "Why did it fail? What did they get wrong?" I looked at the table. I thought about the components Gary Holt had been sorting into a tray on the morning he told me that this does not feel like a real threat. I thought about Priya Chandrasekaran and the 14 years she had spent being present in the Dreth Confederation and elsewhere, not as a strategy, just because she cared. I thought about Prelisvor's face in the library alcove, looking at his data. "They thought they understood what they were dealing with," I said. "They had looked at Earth from the outside, at its formal structures and its official positions and its declared capacities. They had built a picture of it from that vantage point, and that picture told them that if you applied the right pressure in the right places, you would get the outcome you wanted. But the picture was wrong," he said. "The picture was incomplete," I said. "The parts it missed were the parts that matter most, not the formal structures, the actual texture of the civilization, the things that happen below the level of official records." I thought about how to explain the rest of it. "A species that has survived as long as humanity has," I said, "and that has survived the things they have survived, develops a relationship with difficulty that is different from what you would expect. Most species develop an instinct for the path of least resistance, for the accommodation that preserves as much as possible, for the calculation of when to stop. And humans?" he said. "Humans develop a different instinct," I said. "They develop the instinct for what to build next. Whatever situation they are in, they are already thinking about what comes after it. And because they are always thinking about what comes after, they are always building for that future." I paused. "The Accord tried to stop them, and found that you cannot stop a river by putting up a dam. You can change where the river is for a while. You can make the river work harder, but you cannot stop it. And when you put up a dam, you have to reckon eventually with what is on the other side of it." The young attaché looked at the empty table. "So the lesson is, do not try to exclude them?" he said. "The lesson," I said, "is more fundamental than that. The lesson is, look carefully at what you are actually dealing with before you decide what to do about it. Not the surface, the actual texture, the things that do not appear in official reports." He nodded slowly. "How do you find those things?" he said. I thought about Gary Holt sorting components. I thought about Dee Cartwright restocking her display. I thought about Owen Park's 6-month relationship that had been 4 years in the building. "You go to the commercial district," I said. "You talk to people, not the ambassadors, the merchants, the engineers, the ones who show up every day and do the work." He looked at me. "That is your professional advice?" he said. "Talk to merchants?" "Yes," I said. "It is." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up and straightened his jacket. "All right," he said, and walked out. I stayed a while longer. The hall was empty now except for the cleaning staff, who moved through it with the efficient, unhurried pace of people who do this work every session and who have an uncomplicated relationship with the grandeur of the space. It is where they work, and they are good at their work, and they will be done when they are done. I thought about the year I had spent in this assignment. I thought about the first day, walking in and feeling the silence, and the look on Yara Osei's face. and the way she stood up and left when it was done. I thought about everything that had happened between that day and this one. Not a war, not a confrontation in the sense that most people would use the word. A confrontation of a different kind, between what an institution believed was true and what was actually true, between the map and the territory, between the assumption that a civilization can be excluded from a system it is already part of, and the reality of what that actually means when you try to do it. The humans had won. Not because they had fought harder, not because they had been stronger, not because they had done anything that another species could not theoretically have done, because they had been there, genuinely there, present and working and connecting and building, before the resolution and during it and after it, the same pace throughout, the pace of something that has somewhere to be, and enough time to get there. I would write my final report on this assignment over the following week. It would be long and detailed and professional. It would contain recommendations for how observer methodology might be improved to capture the less visible dimensions of civilizational capacity. It would note the limitations of supply chain analysis that relies solely on officially registered commercial entities. It would include a section on the value of conversations with commercial district residents. It would not include everything I had actually learned. Some things are too large for a report. Some things you carry in your understanding and let inform your judgment for the rest of your career without ever putting them fully into words. I left the chamber and walked through the station toward the commercial district. It was mid-morning by then, and the district was in the full swing of its daily activity. Gary Holt's stall was the busiest I had ever seen it. He had hired 2 new assistants, and the display had grown again. D. Cartwright had a line of customers. Owen Park was in conversation with someone who appeared to be negotiating a significant order. I walked through all of it. A human medic from the station's medical center was treating a Cathani dock worker nearby, leaning in to examine something on the dock worker's outer carapace with the focused care of someone who has been doing this work for a long time and has not lost interest in it. The dock worker made a sound that I recognized, in the Cathani communicative repertoire, as something between gratitude and relief. The medic did not acknowledge the sound. She just continued with the examination, doing the work. I watched for a moment. Then I kept walking. Outside the station's observation ports, the docking ring moved in its steady rotation, and ships of many kinds and origins came and went, and the dark between the stars was punctuated by running lights and engine flares and the ordinary traffic of a civilization that is always in motion. Among those ships, distributed throughout the ring and the approaches and the outer systems and the transit corridors, were human vessels, doing what they had been doing through the vote and the embargo and the whisper campaign and all of it, going about their business, at exactly the pace of something that has somewhere to be and enough time to get there. I stood at the observation port for a long time. I thought about the Accord session and its renewed framework and its administrative concerns. I thought about the young attaché and his question about what the lesson was. I thought about Gary Holt, who had told me this does not feel like a real threat, and who had been right. Not because he had known about Laura Finch's 2-page document, or Francis Cole's invoices, or Colin Reeves' 11-year project, but because he had a lifetime of doing honest work and building real relationships and showing up consistently. And from that vantage point, the resolution had looked like what it was, a formality applied to something that formalities cannot reach. The cosmos had voted to ban Earth. 4,718 species, in one of the largest acts of institutional consensus in galactic history. And Earth had received the news, thanked the chair being for the formal notice, capped their pens, and walked out. And gone back to work. And kept building. And kept showing up. And kept being present in every corner of the galaxy where there was something useful to be done, or something interesting to understand, or a relationship worth having, until the institution that had voted to exclude them found, in the cold light of its own supply chain review, that the exclusion was producing problems that the excluded party was uniquely positioned to solve. Until the species that had tried to be pushed to the edge discovered that the edge was not where they had thought it was, because while they were managing the formal structures of galactic politics, humanity had been busy in the spaces between formal structures, quietly and genuinely and without any grand announcement, becoming part of everything, not by force, not by strategy, by being exactly what they were, consistently, persistently, across 400,000 years and every situation those years had contained. I thought about Yara Osei's expression. Not triumph, not vindication. Just the warm, near smile of someone who has seen this ending before. Not this specific story. The general shape of it. The shape of, you tell us to go away, and we say thank you for the notice, and we go back to being what we are, and eventually you discover that what we are is something you cannot actually exclude without excluding yourself. That shape. She had known that shape. All of them had known it, in their different ways. Gary with his settled certainty, Alan with his jurisdictional question, Priya with her 14 years of relationship building, Colin with his 11 years of documentation, Laura with her 2 pages of procedure, Frances with her pleasant voice. They had known because they were the inheritors of everyone who had known it before them, because their history was a long record of that shape, lived through, and learned from, and built upon, across generation after generation, each one passing the knowledge forward. This is what we are. This is what we do when you tell us we cannot. We say thank you for the notice. We go back to work. We keep going. I pressed my hand against the observation port glass. Outside, a human freighter cleared its berth and began the slow, careful arc that would take it toward its departure vector, giving way to other traffic, watching for clearance signals, moving with the patient efficiency of something that has done this 1,000 times and will do it 1,000 times more. It cleared the station's navigational boundary. Its engines brightened. It was gone, going wherever it was going, at exactly its own pace, not asking anyone's permission, not needing to. I stayed at the port until the light of its engines faded into the dark, and then I turned and walked back through the station, through the sound and motion of its ordinary day, past the stalls and the queues and the transactions and the small, ordinary interactions that, accumulated across the breadth of a civilization, become something that no vote can reach. I had a report to write. I had, it seemed, also picked up somewhere along the way a practice of walking through commercial districts and talking to merchants and buying components I did not have an immediate use for. I thought that was probably all right. I thought it was, in its small way, the beginning of something, the beginning of understanding, which is where everything else begins, always. In every civilization that has ever learned anything worth knowing. You start by showing up. You keep showing up. And eventually, if you do it honestly and without expectation, and with genuine attention to the people and places around you, you find that you have built something. Something real. Something that lasts. Something that, when someone else decides you cannot be here, reveals that it was already so deeply here that the decision cannot find a place to stand. That is the lesson. Not the power, not the strategy, not the cleverness. The showing up, the keeping going, the stubborn, patient, 400,000-year refusal to conclude that this particular wall is the one that cannot be passed. The cosmos had voted to ban Earth. Humanity had received the notice, thanked the chair being, walked out the door, and simply kept going. And the cosmos, in the end, had discovered what every wall discovers eventually, when the river has been pressing against it long enough, and steadily enough, and with the full unhurried certainty of something that does not need to rush, because it has nowhere else to be. The water finds the way through. It always does. It always will.